Dear friends, I have great pleasure and honor to introduce to you one of the most experienced politicians in the area of reconciliation, one of the most prominent politicians of our days, and really big friend of Ukraine, Prime Minister Tony Blair. And Krista, floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Okay, well, Prime Minister, how wonderful for all of us to have a chance to talk to you about this very big subject, which has a lot of relevance to many parts of the world, including the country that we're in right now.
Right. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Victor. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for calling me Prime Minister. It's,
it's cheap flattery just to get you off on a good note.
It's the tradition in America and North America, I think, and not in the UK. And when I first left office and I would go to America and they'd introduce me as Prime Minister, the British media used to write that I was so upset at no longer being Prime Minister, I absolutely insisted that people still address me by that title. So I had to tell them to stop. And then they said that I was so upset by not being Prime Minister that I told them never to let me hear the word Prime Minister.
So
anyway,
which is it?
Thank you.
Which is it?
Prime Minister.
Okay. We've been talking a lot about the challenges of reconciliation in Ukraine and the challenges the Ukrainian government faces. You've faced some pretty big reconciliation challenges of your own, both as Prime Minister and working on conflicts in other places. I'd like to start on kind of a personal note, which is when you talk to President Poroshenko, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, just from a leadership point of view, what advice do you give them on how to approach the problem?
Every situation is different, and the reconciliation processes that I've worked on most have been Northern Ireland when I was Prime Minister, then afterwards the Middle East peace process. I think there are three basic lessons that I learned from trying to create a successful process of reconciliation. And I guess you could say in Northern Ireland we did successfully do so. The Middle East is still work in progress, let's say. But I think there are three things that are really important. The first is that in any situation where there is dispute and disagreement, then you need to have a clear equilibrium of power. In other words, you need to be strong enough so that those with whom you are reconciling know that reconciliation is the best and most fruitful path. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, we had come to a point at which it was clear to the IRA that they could not, by terrorism, unite Ireland, but it was also clear to the UK government and to many unionists that we weren't going to be able to crush the spirit of nationalism or republicanism. So, in a sense, the first prerequisite of having reconciliation is that the parties know that they have to reconcile. Okay? I think the second important aspect is that sometimes I say to people that politics is often a far more intellectual business than people think, right? It doesn't seem like that, but it often is. Politics is about a whole lot of very tough and sometimes crude and rather dirty things, but it's also about ideas, about thoughts, and in the case of reconciliation, you have to have an intellectual framework for the reconciliation that is just and seen to be just. In other words, you're not going to reconcile if you've got two opposing points of view. They're not going to come to a process of reconciliation unless there's a framework within which people see that the respective interests are being taken care of, and that there is a method of resolving difference through reconciliation, which then takes the place of resolving it through force or violence. And I think the third thing is that no leader who is ever engaged in a process of reconciliation can ever expect to be free from attack and criticism, right? Reconciliation is one of the hardest acts of leadership. The easiest thing as a leader is to assemble all the people who agree with you and make a stirring speech and get a round of applause, right? But there's not a lot of reconciliation that happens that way, okay? And I always say to people, the toughest thing about being a leader is not saying yes, but saying no, okay? And when you have to say to your own people, look, I know you may want me to go in this direction, but actually I'm going to try to reconcile, then that's when, you know, the leaders do the act of leadership. And so every situation is different, but if I had to pick out three elements, it will be those elements. You have to have sufficient strength to have an equilibrium of power that allows you to be able to negotiate reconciliation. You have to have a framework that is just going forward, and you have to be prepared to lead. Because without
be prepared
leadership,
to be attacked.
You have to be prepared to be attacked. Look, I became British Prime Minister when my party had lost 4 consecutive elections, one after another. And so I was pretty keen on pleasing people. But I remember going to my first meeting as party leader, having been elected party leader, with these 4 election defeats in our mind. And one of my activists got up and said to me, Tony, the British people have now voted against us 4 times in a row. What on earth is wrong with them? So it was when I realized I had a challenge of leadership on my hands. So I came to power wanting to please all of the people all of the time. Now, by the time I left, I wasn't sure I was pleasing any of the people any of the time. But the fact is, as a leader, yeah, the act of leadership is taking responsibility to make decisions. When you make a decision, when you decide, you divide. So,
when you decide, you divide. So you've given us the theory. How did it work in Northern Ireland?
It worked in Northern Ireland because, as I say, people recognised there was no military victory that was going to be possible. It worked because we created in the Good Friday Agreement an intellectual framework for essentially the nationalists conceding that Northern Ireland would stay part of the United Kingdom as long as a majority of people wanted it, and the Unionists conceding there had to be equity and justice and fair treatment for nationalists and Republicans and Catholics. So that was the intellectual framework, and it succeeded because there were leaders on the Republican side, the nationalist side, the Unionist side, that were prepared to lead.
You've talked a lot about the criticism leaders have to take. Who were your fiercest critics? Who got mad at you over this?
Who got mad at me?
Yeah.
It'd be easier to ask who didn't, actually, but look, everyone, because you're always, trying to maneuver your way through. But I think, what I learned about leadership in the context of reconciliation is that, I always say to people, when you're a leader, you've always got to distinguish between strategy and tactics, right? Your strategic objective, that's what you believe in, that's your destination, that's where you're moving towards. And that should remain constant and clear and be strongly advocated. But your tactics mean you have to do a certain maneuvering. Now, when you're maneuvering through that, you're going to get attacked by everybody. But provided the strategic objective is clear, then in my view, you can usually get to your destination. But it's amazing how many political leaders end up confusing strategy and tactics, and then big mess.
Has that ever happened to you?
That's a bit of a sharp question, actually. Yes. Yeah, I did on a few occasions, which I won't mention, but yeah, no doubt, of course. And it's one of the things you learn. Because the worst thing, by the way, is not deciding your strategic objective and setting off on a tactic. That's a total disaster. So, yeah.
So that ISIS, we don't have a strategy point. You had to have a little bit of sympathy with that. We don't have a strategy yet. Important to get that first.
Well, that's a whole, look, in the Middle East right now, there is an immediate problem, which is ISIS, and I think President Obama is absolutely right to get the broadest coalition to deal with it. But I personally think you've got a long-term strategic issue, which is about the Middle East, about the forces of change in the Middle East, and if I'm very honest about it, I think also within Islam, an unresolved question around modernity and the future. And I think what you're actually witnessing in the Middle East today is an agonizing and long process of transition from societies that have weak institutions, have had old-style strongmen governments that don't work anymore in the modern world, young populations desperate for change, and then what you've got, and I see this all over the Middle East today, is you've got three elements in competition with each other. You've got the old guard leadership that wants to stay in power, that the West like to deal with because they provide stability, except they don't anymore. Secondly, you've got Islamists who are numerous and well organized. And then thirdly, I would say you've got more open-minded liberals who are numerous and badly organized. And the question is how we get that third group organized and able, in the end, to determine the future of their countries, because ultimately in these countries with very young populations, and the average age of a country like Egypt is 25, the average age in the European Union today is more late 30s, early 40s. These are young populations. The people need hope for the future, but their only hope is actually to open their minds, get connected to the world. There isn't really a future in that Islamist ideology. But that's the struggle that's going on in the Middle East. So I think in respect of, I think President Obama's put together a strategy on ISIS now, but we also need a strategy for the whole of the Middle East.
So this sort of picture you paint of societies undergoing very deep, very complicated transitions and still being on the journey doesn't sound a lot like your reconciliation model, where the parties need to be at a dead end with what they're doing before they can come to the table. Is the Middle East in a place where it's able to come to the table, or does this transition have to run its course?
I think the transition has to run its course, I'm afraid. Which is not to say that you can't get reconciliation, but to return to my first point, that you have to have sufficient strength to reconcile. You also have to come to a decision about what type of society you want. Now, my view is that the world works today through connectivity. Right? That's the secret of the world. And, the way that you create modern economies today is by obviously having the basic things like infrastructure and rule of law and proper rules for doing business and so on. But then further than that, you have to educate your young people for the modern world, for this world of connectivity. If you don't, then they're not going to be able to function in the modern world. And the problem is in the Middle East is that you've had this rapid rise in population. I mean, for example, Egypt 30, 40 years ago was a population of 30 million people. Today it's 90 million. You often hear a debate in the Middle East about the so-called Sykes-Picot agreement of 1920. And one of the interesting things about being British Prime Minister or former British Prime Minister is that virtually wherever you go in the world, at some point someone says it's all the fault of the British. Probably except in Ukraine, actually. I'm trying to think. Was it our fault? No, I don't think so.
There may be a Yalta. There could be a Yalta thing.
Yes, there could. Yes. Okay, it's our fault too. But so, if you think back 100 years to Sykes-Picot, it's interesting. The size of the populations in those days. Syria, under 2 million people. Saudi Arabia, not 3 million. You look at the populations today, they're 10 times that. So there's been this explosion in population in these countries. Very young people not really educated for the modern world. And that's what is, that's why this process of transition has to go on. So the direct answer to your question is, I think you're going to have to go through this process of transition in order to get to reconciliation.
How long does it take, do you think?
I think the world moves faster nowadays.
Richard Haas has compared it to a 30 years war and has said that's what's going to be happening. We just have to manage it as best we can. Is
right.
that...
I mean, Christianity took several hundred years to, to make our adjustments. I think this is going to happen faster.
So faster than several hundred?
Huh?
Faster than several hundred years?
Yeah, no, I think the way the world works today is that I think we will see this change. If I look as good as Victor's dad does today, then when I'm his age, then maybe even in my time. But no, I think you will see the changes that are happening in the Middle East are necessary, they're inevitable. I think the West did not really understand the so-called Arab Spring, Arab revolutions. They were the product of these very deep-seated forces. And you're not going to, you couldn't suppress those forces anymore. But I think the world moves faster today, and I think and hope, especially if we are with a clear position ourselves, I think this process can work faster.
And what do we do in the meantime? I mean, there's a lot of suffering, a lot of death, which is happening as part of that transition, a lot of fear that there's going to be collateral damage in other parts of the world. So transition has to run its course. What are we supposed to be doing?
Right, so again, I think there are certain clear principles. The first is the Middle East matters, and we've got to stay engaged. We, the West, and actually the East, as a matter of fact. The Middle East matters because of security. It matters still because of energy. But it matters most of all, in my view, because the Middle East is the heart and soul of Islam. I mean, a couple of days ago with my foundation, I was in Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world today. But even a country like Indonesia is affected by the ideas that come out of the Middle East. So if the Middle East is in bad shape, religiously, it affects the world, okay? So the Middle East matters. We have to stay engaged. The lesson I learned from Iraq particularly, but also from Afghanistan, is that the problem is when, you have these very repressive regimes, institutions are weak, tensions are suppressed, the people suffer, but then when you take the lid off, out comes the unresolved tensions of an ethnic and a tribal and a religious nature. Now, I think as the Arab revolutions have shown, that process is inevitable, but I think if we could achieve evolutionary change, it would be better than revolutionary change. Right, so, but now we're faced with these revolutions. In my view, again, we've got to support those people who support the open-minded, liberal-minded approach.
And how support? What form should that support take? Is there a danger it's seen as interference?
The curious thing, I think, today with the Middle East is that it's moved beyond the debates we had post 9/11. So John Kerry and President Obama are assembling a coalition that will include many Arab countries. Sometimes you're going to have to fight the terrorists. Sometimes you're going to have to support through institution building. Sometimes you're going to have to support by creating the right alliances for support. Now, none of this is easy. To give you, a few days back I was in Egypt with the president there. It's very controversial in certain quarters for obvious reasons to support the president there.
And do you support the president there?
I do. I think it's essential, even though I disagree on some of the things that are happening, such as the imprisonment of the journalists and the NGO representatives and so on. I disagree with that, and I make that quite clear. But I also believe that if Egypt succeeds, it's possible for the Middle East to stabilize far faster. Whereas if the Muslim Brotherhood had continued in power in Egypt, I think it would have been a big disaster for the region. I would also, just to put this before you, I'd watch Libya as much as Syria. I think Libya is a real problem now.
Say a little bit more about that. Having gotten us worried, what do you see happening there?
What is happening is that the country is divided along the lines of different militia. There are large numbers of weapons going east into the Middle East, including Egypt, south down into the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa. I think the resurgence of Boko Haram over these last months is in many ways fueled by what is coming out of Libya. And, you know, Libya is right on the doorstep of Europe. So I think we want to watch that very, very carefully. And it shows the difficulties of getting the right policy, because we, in one sense in Libya, you know, we didn't want to repeat the exercise of Iraq and put ground troops in there, but the point is that if you don't have any force that is stabilizing the country, then you're in a situation where these militia can just get out there and start creating chaos. And then out of chaos, I mean, one of the interesting things I think you learn about politics, and this has got relevance to reconciliation, is that you can't have any process of reconciliation unless there is a minimum stability. You know, in other words, chaos is the enemy of progress. So the moment you get chaos and instability, you can't make progress. And right now in Libya, the difficulty is whatever the people want, the war between the different factions is making progress impossible.
So would stronger Western intervention have been a good idea? Create that stability?
I mean, I personally argued at the time that it would have been better if we'd agreed a process of change with Gaddafi. I think probably in Syria, if we'd managed to agree a process of transition, it would have been better. And that's precisely because of what we went through in Iraq and Afghanistan. Anyway, for reasons I completely understand, that didn't happen. And now we're in a situation where we're going to have to do whatever we can to support those within those countries that are trying to do the right thing by their people.
That vision of managed evolutionary change sounds great, but isn't it directly contradicted by the processes you've been talking about this rising young generation that isn't really going to put up with that?
Well, I think, though, that what happens over time is that through the experience of the consequences of instability and chaos, actually people do start to regard a process of evolution as preferable. But evolution only works if it is an actual process of change. And what I keep saying to people is about, if you look back 15, 20 years in the Middle East, it's really clear, and by the way, some people were saying this at the time, that this situation couldn't hold. So even though the West was dealing with governments on the basis, let's deal with them, they're stable, at least we know what we're dealing with, actually there was a process underneath the surface of huge political turmoil that was always at some point going to erupt. So I think, as I say, the question is now for us is to identify those people within the Middle East who basically do understand that the future has got to be about educated, open-minded, connected societies, and help them.
You've talked about your recent time in Egypt. Did you talk there about Israel and Hamas? And if so, what did you say?
Yes, of course. I mean, the main purpose of being there actually was about the peace process in Gaza. Yeah, it's difficult. How long have you got? I mean, Look, I think it remains fundamentally important, by the way, for the region, the Middle East peace process. Do not believe those people who say, as a result of all these other issues, the Palestinian issue doesn't matter. It does matter. It's still fundamentally important. But it's got some of the same aspects to it as the rest of the problems of the region. So very simply, what do I think has to happen? In the immediate term, I think two things have to happen. We have to get a new deal for Gaza that opens it back up to the world, at the same time as putting Gaza back under the authority of the Palestinian government, so that you deal with the security threat for Israel. And secondly, you've got to relaunch a peace process that clearly offers the vision of a Palestinian state for the Palestinian people. And, you know, even though I do not believe that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the cause of the problems of the region, I don't think that, but I do think resolving it would be an enormous boost to what I would call the modern-minded people within the region.
What does that new deal for Gaza that you just referred to look like?
It comprises these elements. It means opening up Gaza so that people can bring goods and materials in, start reconstructing the place. There's a massive job of reconstruction to be done. The damage this time in Gaza is far worse than previously. It means that the private sector can start building industry again and exporting their goods, so you need to open up access and movement. At the same time, you need the Palestinian government in Ramallah in the West Bank to come back in charge of Gaza and to take over charge of security, because in the end the Israelis will expect to see a Gaza that is no longer a security threat. So it's putting those two things together, and I think that is a lot easier to achieve if there is also a vision at least created, a framework created for Palestinian statehood.
In talking about the preconditions that were necessary in Northern Ireland for the reconciliation to work, you described both force and power, having to have power, and also both parties to the conflict realizing it couldn't go on. Their strategies weren't going to win. Are the Israelis and the Palestinians at that point?
That's a good question, and the answer is I'm not sure. I think there are three basic preconditions to get a successful negotiation, apart from the actual negotiation. The first is Palestinian politics has got to be unified, but on the right terms. In other words, terms that promote peace. But you can't have a divided Palestinian politics and a divided Gaza and West Bank and create peace. It's not going to work. So you're going to have unity, but on the right terms. Second, the Israelis have got to take a strategic decision that it's in their interests to promote Palestinian statehood and start to treat the Palestinians as well as they possibly can, subject to security. And that means doing a whole series of things on the ground that can give the Palestinians greater freedom over their own affairs and give them a real sense that a state is possible. And the third thing is, because of everything that is happening in the region, the regional players are going to have to step up and take some responsibility too. And that's why the role of Egypt in the recent Gaza conflict was very important. But I don't think my instinct now is you won't make peace with the Israelis and Palestinians kind of separated out of the region, as it were, just in isolation from the rest of the region. So the role of Egypt, the role of Jordan, the role of the key Gulf players is fantastically important.
And you've said you feel the Egyptians are coming to the table. How about the other players?
I think there's a willingness, but, that's why, for Arab countries to come and really help with the peace process, they have to feel that Israel is really serious about Palestinian statehood.
And your judgment on that?
I believe the Israeli public would still go for a Palestinian state, and I actually think the Prime Minister would too. But we have to understand how this Gaza conflict is seen first by the public in Israel and then by the rest, a large part of the international community. For the Israelis, they see this as, we left Gaza, we took our settlers with us. Now we have a conflict with 3,500 rockets or 4,000 rockets fired at us, tunnels, used to try and kidnap our people. So why do you think a state is possible from the perspective of our security? The Palestinians would say, you locked down Gaza, we were unable to move, we were unable to have any freedom, you don't give us a perspective for statehood. So my view is the only thing that works is a clear, when I was talking about strategic objectives, the strategic objective of a Palestinian state based on 67 lines with land swaps if that strategic objective was clear and accepted by everybody, then I think you would start to make better tactical decisions as to how you get there. But without that, it's very hard.
You've been describing for us, Prime Minister, a world with a lot of change, a lot of conflict. You're deeply engaged in it. If you were Prime Minister of Britain today, do you think you would have a hard time mustering domestic support for foreign policy? It's sort of a truism right now that people in Britain, in the developed Western countries, are feeling pretty exhausted. Economies are stagnant. Median wages are stable at best, and that people are getting kind of tired of all of this. How do you think it is for Western leaders to get public support for involvement?
Yeah, it's tough. And by the way, one thing I've learned since leaving office is that it's a lot easier to give the advice than take the decision. So, you know, so I say there's a great deal of humility. But here's the thing. You see, there is no alternative but to staying engaged. I mean, I think if the last couple of years teaches us anything, it's that if you say, right, that's someone else's problem, suddenly we find it's our problem. I mean, the single biggest security threat for Britain, France, and Germany today are returning jihadist fighters from Syria. So I think the problem with this issue, and I say this self-critically as well from my own time in office, I think you've got to look at this radical Islamist issue like in some ways, it's reminiscent to me of the 20th century ideological battles that took place over a long period of time. In other words, we've got to see this not in terms of the next election cycle or one prime minister or one president. We've got to see it as a generational struggle that is about this process of modernization, and it's going to require different responses at different times. You know, sometimes, as we saw with the Cold War, for example, sometimes you were in fighting mode, sometimes you were in uneasy peace mode, sometimes you were actually making progress. But all the way through, you know, people recognized they were in a long-term struggle and they just had to keep at it. I think that's the best way of looking at this. I mean, I heard David Petraeus, when I was doing something with him a few months back in the US, give what I thought was a very coherent view to that point, that, you know, the best way for the political leaders today to try and lead our public is to get people to understand it's not an option to disengage, and don't look at this as if there's going to be a clean victory. You know, we're going to win now. You know, and let's be clear, even if we go in and take this action, which we should do against ISIS, even if you beat the Daesh and hit them very hard, that's not going to be the end of it. You know, you're still going to have, as I say, the problems in Libya, the problems in Yemen. You know, we look at all over the world today, there are these difficulties. So my view is we need to recognize this as a global problem. We need a globally coordinated strategy. It will be a mixture of force, diplomacy, and support, and it's going to take a generation. It's not going to be finished under this Prime Minister or this President. If you start to look at it like that, then I think you get yourself in the right frame of mind where there's no concept of being weary about it, because it's a fact, right? If you'd said to people in the 1980s, you know, we're kind of weary of the Cold War, they would have said, well, you know, we might be weary of it, might not be, but it's a fact, so we're just living with it. We're doing what we need to do. If we start looking at this issue like that, I think we've got a better chance of getting the right psychological frame of mind for ourselves.
I find that very intellectually persuasive. Is it sellable at the ballot box, or are you going to have politicians finding it's easier to sell disengagement?
Look, I want to say something that may strike you as incredibly naive after being 10 years British Prime Minister. I think if you basically trust the people and you put before them what you really think as a leader, I think you're more likely to win than to lose.
That's your secret of politics? Tell people what you really think?
You know, I think in a funny way, I think that's the better way to do it. Because here's the thing about politics. People do prefer leadership in the end. You know, don't forget, they elect you to be the leader. Right. Now, they also believe that it's their right to criticize you the entire time. But just give you a little anecdote. When I was Prime Minister, I fought my third election in 2005. And that was after the Iraq War. It was very difficult. There was a lot of criticism. Right. And when I started the campaign, very welcome thing happened. My two oldest sons, Nicky and Ewan, they said to me, they'd never shown any interest in doing this before, but they said to me, Dad, we're going to come and campaign with you. And I was really touched by this. So we took them out to a kind of one of the marginal constituencies to campaign. And I was in the town centre making a speech. And the two boys went knocking on the door, you know, the old-fashioned politics. Anyway, my son Nicky knocked on a door and opened the door, and the guy could see he was from the Labour Party. And the guy launches into this tirade about me. You know, I hate that Tony Blair. I can't stand him. Every time I see him on the television, I want to put my foot through the, you know, so he gives him this big thing. So anyway, shuts the door in his face. Nicky goes off down the street, and he sees Ewan a little bit further up the street. And he says, hey, Ewan, you want to go and knock on the door of number 18 there? There's a guy there, big fan of Dad's. He'd love to hear from you. So Ewan thinks, oh, finally I've got someone who's going to say something nice. So he knocks on the door. Guy opens the door, sees another Labour Party person. So he launches into an even more bitter tirade about me and all the terrible things I've done and so on and so forth. And Ewan is a bit more sensitive. So says to him, after about listening to this 5 minutes, says to him, you know, you're talking about my dad. And the guy says, oh my God, son, I'm so sorry. Come in and have a cup of tea. And the point is, you know, at the same time as he's giving the abuse, he kind of knows leadership's tough. So the thing as a leader is, in the end, you're best to lead, because that's in fact what they put you there for. Anyway, that's my view.
Okay, well, at this point, I can't resist asking you about the big challenge that Britain is facing in the coming days. Neil Ferguson has described you as, I think, Britain's 11th Scottish Prime Minister. What is going to happen in Scotland, and what's the best outcome?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, I hope that Scotland votes to stay part of the United Kingdom. And for all the reasons that have been given by all the main party leaders in the UK, I think in the 21st century to rip up the alliance between our countries would not be sensible politically, economically, or even emotionally. So I very much hope that's the outcome.
We're in Kyiv. We've been in Yalta before for this conference. We can't be there because Crimea has been invaded and annexed by Russia. This is surely a subject in desperate need of reconciliation. Do you see a path to the resolution of, Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, I think there is a path, but I think the three principles that I outlined are pretty relevant. I mean, after all, this is an annexation of territory in Europe. There is a ceasefire in place now, but I think it's got to be made absolutely and solidly clear from the point of view of the West that Ukraine is a free and an independent country and has the right to remain so, and that its future should be decided by its people without outside interference. So I think the clearer we are and the stronger we are on that principle, the more likely we are to get reconciliation.
clarity you've achieved just with what you've said. How is strength demonstrated? What's the mix of pressure on Russia, support for Ukraine?
I think that the strength is indicated by the West, as I think it is doing, indicating that it does want reconciliation. However, it's not going to allow a solution to be imposed by outside interference. And so, you know, I think the measures that have been taken are important, but what I think will be very important is that we don't lose interest over time. Right? Because there is a danger that of a process of kind of attrition over time that then weakens the support for Ukraine's independence. I think, and I actually believe this will be the case, by the way, I think that Europe and the United States, the Western countries, have got to make it very clear that we will continue to stand with Ukraine and will continue all the way through. Now, the whole set of economic questions and the support and so on, I think the deep and comprehensive trade agreement is very important. I actually think the compromise that was worked out was important as well.
You don't worry that that represents backsliding and unnecessary concession? I
think the fact, if it is actually now implemented, I know the implementation's been delayed, but not the principle of it, but that is the test. And that's what I mean by saying that you can't back away from this or lose interest in it.
What about the argument that actually this is the West's fault? That Ukraine naturally belongs to a Russian sphere of geopolitical influence, that there was too much encroachment on Russia, the enlargement of NATO, and so forth?
Look, I think you can make lots of arguments about how we got into this situation, and some of those will not be to the West's credit. But the fact is the fact. The territory was annexed. And, you know, in the end, it is important that the independence of the country is maintained. And look, I understand President Putin's desire for Russian nationalism, but it's an interesting reflection to me about how you express national sentiment in the world today. Because pride in your country is a great thing. You know, I'm proud of my country. So I understand nationalist feeling. But you're best to give people that sense of national pride by making, in the case of Russia, the reforms necessary in the economy and in society to make it strong as a country, strong internally, so that its young people think there's a hope and want to stay there.
Щоб молоді люди думали про це як про
So that it can take its place in the community of nations. And I think it would be a real shame, particularly in the light of the other challenges we face, if we went back to a complete barrier between East and West. I think this would be very unfortunate and, you know, long-term very bad for people in Russia.
President Poroshenko faces his own reconciliation challenge inside Ukraine, particularly with those, you know, that part of the Donbass that has been frozen under separatist control. What should he do there?
Well, I think, look, he's got a very, very tough set of decisions. And I think his approach, which is to look at the issue of decentralization or devolution, but make sure he keeps his country together, is the right approach. Now,
could apply to some other countries, we know.
Correct. I still think it's the right approach. But, you know, this is when we think of, you know, all those conferences at Yalta I've been to with Victor over the past years, and the Yalta European strategy, I mean, my feeling has always been that Ukraine's natural home is with Europe, but, you know, I don't see that as opposed to Russia. I just think in terms of values and society, you know, I've always been a strong supporter of Ukraine and being in Europe, and I remain so.
I'm going to ask the Prime Minister one more question, then I'm going to let other people have a chance. So if you have a question, get ready. You've said that one of the biggest security challenges that Britain now faces, and some other European countries, is returning jihadis. Why do they go in the first place? And what does that say about what's happening in British society?
You see, I think there is a tendency, I mean, I read an article the other day of people saying, well, you know, we've got a search within British society as to why you get these young people going off and fighting jihad. I get a bit uncomfortable with that. I mean, you know, some of these people, they've had the benefits of UK free education, free healthcare. You know, we've made every effort in the UK over the years to be open to people of different cultures and faiths. If you look at London today, it's a great multicultural, multi-faith city. So I don't think the problem's within British society. I think this is an ideology that is driven at people from the outside. And I will make an additional point that is often disputed by people. I think when you see these extremists, they are at the end of what, in my view, is a spectrum, right? In other words, they aren't large in number, the extremists, but the ideology that views the world as this is how you have to be, and you have to be a Muslim, and you have to be a Muslim of this persuasion, and if you're not, you're the enemy. That ideology, in my view, goes a lot deeper. And, you know, if you look at some of these...
Goes a lot deeper in Britain?
Huh?
Goes a lot deeper in Britain, including in Muslim communities in Britain?
I think there is a problem in certain communities in Britain. That's not to say the majority of Muslims in Britain aren't absolutely opposed to this and decent law-abiding people. But I think, yes, I think there has been a problem over a period of time with communities in European countries that have not integrated. And my point about, I support a multicultural society, but I support it in this way. In my view, the only thing that works in countries like ours is that you have a space that is held in common, right? And there are certain things that everyone has to conform to there, because those are the basic principles of your society. And then you have your own cultural practices. But in my view, you're not entitled to say, my cultural practice allows me to discriminate against women. No, that's the common space. These are our rules. So you play by those rules, everyone, whatever your culture, whatever your faith. Now, outside of that, you're free to worship God in your own way. But within that space, those basic democratic rights, they're what we all agree to. That's the basic social contract, and that can't, in my view, ever be compromised with. Likewise, outside in the Middle East, the truth is, you know, it is a bigger and broader problem. If you look at some of the most radical clerics in the Middle East, some of them have got online followings that run into millions of people. So I'm afraid in the end, I mean, I know this is difficult because people don't want to really hear it at the moment. If the problem were a few fanatics, we could easily take care of it. It isn't, I'm afraid. It goes a lot deeper than that.
Okay, so some questions, please. And then go to you next.
Mr. Prime Minister, I'm impressed your presentation. Thank you very much. And I want to put you some strategic question. What you are thinking about possibility, and more important about the necessity, the starting of process of reconciliation between the United States and Russia, it means between NATO and Russia, over their quiet war over Ukraine. Because we have no war with Russia. It's practically we in process of war between Washington and Moscow in geopolitics, and between Brussels and Moscow in geoeconomics. A good news from yesterday that we reached compromise and some start process of reconciliation in geoeconomics.
I just want to share with you my own experience, because obviously I dealt with President Putin for a long time when I was in office. I can honestly say that the desire of people like myself and I believe this was true, by the way, of President Bush as well, our desire was to create the right type of partnership with Russia. And indeed, President Obama came in and famously said he's going to reset relations. So, you know, the problem is that to have that type of reconciliation, you know, I was talking about my 3 principles, right? Let's say we're both quite strong. The intellectual framework of the way forward, that's where I'm afraid there's just a disagreement. You know, and now, can we overcome that disagreement in time? I hope so. But it's very difficult in the end for people to come to a genuine accord if they just have a fundamentally different perspective about the way the world works. And it's a bit of a problem. And I don't, you know, so I mean, as I say, I speak as someone who, I think I was one of the leaders who went to see President Putin first in St. Petersburg, actually, when a lot of European leaders weren't having a lot to do with them. And so I always wanted that. I mean, I think there were those of us who thought at a certain point that actually we should, in time, expand the European Union a great deal eastwards. I don't know. But if there's not at the heart of that partnership a sort of shared sense of values, it's very difficult. And I, you know, unless that changes, I think we're in for quite a long and difficult period, which is not to say we don't have to resolve issues where we can. You know, I've, for example, right from the beginning on Syria, said you're going to have to try and work with Russia on this. So I'm not against working with Russia in the forums we need to work with them, and part of the art of statecraft, actually, is to be able to both have the disagreement and occasionally to be able to work together. But I can't, that bigger picture, I can't see that coming together unless there's some shared sense of value somewhere in there.
Drawing on your knowledge, your long knowledge of President Putin, has he changed, or we just didn't understand him at first?
I never know about this. Having been subject to a number of psychological profiles myself, I'm a little bit hesitant about them.
Not psychologically, ideologically.
I think he's always been a Russian nationalist, actually. But I think over time, he came to see that as best expressed in opposition to the West. Whereas, and he had always a very clear view that we wanted to impose spheres of influence. And this is what I mean by saying, I'm trying to choose my words carefully here because these are very sensitive and difficult subjects. But you see, my view of Ukraine is that if Ukraine wants to be part of Europe, and I hope it does, but I think if it wants to be part of Europe, it should be free to be part of Europe. That's what I think. If Ukraine turned around and said, no, actually, we don't want that, I'd also say, well, there you are. We don't have a good enough offer. You know, so I'm trying to be honest here, it wouldn't be conceivable to me to say, I don't care whether you want to be part of Europe or not. I regard you as part of my sphere of influence and you're coming in. And you know what I mean? There's two different attitudes there. One is basically, I'm afraid one is based on freedom and the other isn't.
Okay, we're going to have a very little brief pause because we have a friend of Yes who wants to make an announcement, David, about a Ukrainian-Austrian support project. So please.
Dear Mr. Pinchuk, Mr. Tony Blair, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me thank Mr. Pinchuk very much that I have the possibility to give you a small presentation. My name is David Ungerklein. I come from Vienna. I am here to issue an invitation to all of you. I invite you to continue the international discourse about the economic, political and legal prospects of the Ukraine in the city of Vienna. We want to build on the impulse annually set so superbly by the Yalta European Strategy in Vienna to find steps of implementation for the development and the security of peace and wealth throughout Europe. The role of Ukraine at this time and its future is crucial at this process. As the initiator of the annual International Vienna Congress Consult and the European Platform for Infrastructure, Future Business, one of our special concerns is the international exchange of views. These views we have been exchanging during the last 12 years with special guests like Bill Gates, Shimon Peres, President Václav Klaus, Jimmy Wales, who I see here, Mohamed El Baradei, and several others, and the exchange of views about important key issues in Europe. And there is no doubt that the future of the Ukraine is one crucial topic for Europe and the whole world. Therefore, this year we put a particular and highly relevant focus on the Ukraine and express this by using the brand Future Business Ukraine, FPU, as the theme for 4 conferences under the umbrella of the Vienna Congress Consult. Traditionally, Vienna is a very important place for dialogues at the heart of Europe. During our 4-part series of events, under the motto, the need to transform Ukraine's international standing and relationships, we will concretely discuss the political and economic prospects of the Ukraine. Future Business Ukraine, 4 conferences between October 2014 and January 2015 in the premises of the Vienna Hofburg. One will be on the 1st of October. We start with the topic Ukraine and the constitutional reform, working in close cooperation with the German Ukraine Forum. On the 3rd of November, we discuss energy in the Ukraine. On the 4th of December, we talk about business in the Ukraine. And 19th of 20th of January, the motto of the Vienna Congress shall be improving Ukraine's geopolitical relationships with the US, the European Union and Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very much looking forward to top-class keynotes and panels and just such an audience. I'm looking forward to constructive informal talks and to mutual views and solution approaches. And I'm very much looking forward to your personal attendance on debates and your support. We're looking for practical solutions to take this process forward. Thank you very much for this opportunity and see you in Vienna.
I see Victor's idea of Ukrainian conferences has been spreading. Okay, the Prime Minister has kindly agreed to take one final question, and I think it should go to a Ukrainian because we're in Ukraine. So I think Sviatoslav Vakarchuk, you may not know him, Prime Minister. This is probably...
We've already got
you
it
met?
rated,
Yeah, okay.
So, Mr. Prime Minister, not former, just Prime Minister, okay. I have a tricky question. Probably we don't talk about black and white situation, let's say deep gray and light gray situation. So imagine you are still in power and you need to have a decision on a very serious topic, and which is vital for the country. And there are 2 decisions. One, you're sure that 70% probability it will make a benefit for the country, but only 30% that you'll stay in power after that. Another is that you're sure that it's only 30% probability that it make the benefit for the country, but you'll 70% stay in power after that. What would you choose? Thank you.
Well,
Okay.
well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be asked a question by one of Ukraine's foremost rock stars. He was also a politician. I always wanted to be a rock star, but I always say to people, though, it's a very fortunate thing that when I was in my rock band in the 1970s, there was no social media at the time. Otherwise, I would definitely not be sitting here. And before I answer it, let me also just thank you, Christia. Christia, by the way, is now a Canadian Member of Parliament. Although, frankly, I think from this questioning, you are both too smart and too polite. So, but I'm sure there's another side to you that will come out when you get in the...
I can be meaner next time.
Yeah, that was a daft thing to say, wasn't it? Sorry. You're exactly right as you are. You're only ever going to get... It would actually be quite interesting if a politician said, no, actually, if it benefited the country but didn't benefit me, no, I choose me. Yeah. So, but actually, I hope, this is all you can say as a politician, I hope I would choose the thing that was right for the country. And I tell you the reason why, and it's not simply for some grand reason of, you know, doing the right thing and all of that. It's because one of the hardest things that you realize in politics is quite difficult to work out sometimes what is the right thing. Okay? In those circumstances, the best thing is to do what you think is right. Because the one thing that would be really bad is to do what you thought was the wrong thing, and it turned out to have been the wrong move. That's very bad. So I actually think in the end, as I say, sometimes in politics, you're going to do a maneuver. It's a calculation. That's the business of politics. There's no point in people getting too elevated about the business of politics. But I honestly and deeply believe when it comes to the big, big issues, the things that determine your country's future, you should do what is right, not just for reasons of moral principle, but also because ultimately, I think it's probably the smartest politics. And by the way, if you believe in something and you're prepared to go out and argue it, even if you lose the argument and they throw you out, at least you sleep a little better at night. So, thank you.
Okay, I think that's a suitably inspiring note on which to conclude. And let's thank the Prime Minister. You've gone from Syria, Egypt, Gaza, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Ukraine, wide lessons in leadership. It's been wonderful to listen to.